Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you the definitive review of the new Sony FE 20mm F1.8 wide-angle prime for full-frame mirrorless. Today's episode is sponsored by The Ridge, the wallet redefined. I don't know about you, but I noticed quite a few years back that pants are changing, and I reached a place where my pants no longer had enough room in them in the way that they were cut and designed to even fit my wallet in the back pocket or the front pocket anymore. And so as a byproduct of that, I've spent a lot of the last few years carrying my wallet around if I'm actually needed, or keeping it in my car, or even with my phone, putting a few credit cards in a case in the back, because I just don't find that I can carry my wallet comfortably. That's where the Ridge enters in that it's a complete redesign of the concept of a wallet. This allows you to carry up to 12 cards. It's expandable. It gives you a clip in the back if you want to carry some cash along with you. Easily slip it in your pocket. Nice and slim. In fact, I've got a couple of Ridges here, and you'll note that both of them fit inside the footprint of what my old wallet did. And right now you can get 10% off along with free worldwide shipping and returns by going to ridge.com/Dustin. That's ridge.com/Dustin, and use the code Dustin to get 10% off and that free shipping. It's interesting, I was having a conversation with another lens manufacturer about a year and a half ago, and they were asking what I thought was needed on the Sony system. And the ironic thing is that basically the lens I described is the Sony 20mm F1.8G. It was one of the ones that I detailed as being necessary. Something almost exactly like this in terms of maximum aperture, in terms of build and size, and of course in terms of performance. So I don't know if Sony was eavesdropping on that conversation, but after spending a few weeks with the new 20mm F1.8G, I am pretty delighted in what this lens represents. One of the things that I look for as a reviewer who covers a variety of different platforms is that I find a lens is really set apart when it's not just the best that's available on its particular platform, but when I can look cross-platform and say, this lens is doing something better or is more complete as a package of what anything that I have tested for any of the systems that I test for. And I have to say that over the last year or so, there have been a number of new Sony releases that have achieved just that. Lenses including the 135mm f1.8 GM, the 24mm f1.4 GM, even the 200 to 600mm G lens. That these are lenses that are just a little bit more complete than anything else that I'm really comparing them to. And I believe that that is true of the 20mm f1.8 G lens as well. Now today we're going to do the definitive review where we're going to go in detail on all the various aspects of lens design and performance. Now if you prefer a shorter, more abbreviated overview type review, then I recommend that you check out the standard review, which you can find at this link. But if you want all the nitty-gritty, all the details, you're in the right place. Let's jump in and let's take a look at the build and the design of this particular lens. So the first thing I want to point out is that this is basically pretty close to a perfect form factor, I think, for this particular lens. I think any smaller, they would have had to start making some compromises in terms of the feature set and the optical performance. And any larger, I think, would have been gratuitous. And so this really, for me, is a sweet spot in terms of actual physical size. It is actually surprisingly longer than what the Tamron lens is, the 20mm f2.8. I suspect the Tamron went in somewhere along this joint right here, because the overall difference is the Tamron is 63.5 millimeters. This is 84.7 millimeters, so right around 21 millimeters longer. It doesn't necessarily feel that much bigger to me, however, and that's in part because the Tamron and the 20mm f1.8G here are basically the same in diameter. Both have a 67mm front filter thread, and we have got a 73.5mm diameter versus 73mm for the Tamron. And so, yeah, obviously it is longer, but it doesn't feel big on the camera. It still feels very compact. And so I don't think that size is going to be an issue for anyone, nor is weight. This is a really nicely made lens, but it's not heavy, 373 grams or 13.16 ounces. you can see that, you know, it's about palm sized, and it has a little bit of heft to it, but it's not going to be an issue for anyone, I don't believe. What we do have here is a very nicely made lens with definitely some metals and then some good engineered plastics in the construction. We do have a gasket here that surprisingly is a little bit thicker than some of the ones that I see on Sony lenses. Maybe those complaints about those tiny little gaskets are kind of starting to penetrate. But also you've got a fluorine coating on the front, and as you can see from this diagram, you have a number of different seal points inside. You have the hybrid approach to aperture that we find on the GM lenses, and that there is an aperture ring here, 1/3 stop to tenths, and you can switch it into auto as well. You also have an option to declick, however, and to smoothly rack through the whole aperture. Though this is aperture by wire, just like it's focus by wire, so you have to have the lens attached and powered on for there to be any kind of result when you move the rings. As far as the focus goes, I find the damping a little bit on the light side. However, this is a linear focus ring, so focus pulls are repeatable. Not bad, it's just, you know, there isn't a whole lot of feel there. It's just a little too light. You do have a focus hold button, you have an AF/MF switch, and obviously it does come with the lens hood. Inside we've got 9 rounded aperture blades, and it is an optical formula of 14 elements in 12 groups, with a number of those being special elements. You have the ability to focus down to 0.19 meters or 0.63 feet, and just note that that, as always, is measured from the sensor, and so you'll see this little mark along the side of the camera, so about midway, mid-frame through, that's where that measurement starts from. And so you're only talking about 18 centimeters in total, so just a little over a half foot. And so what that means is that you don't really have a whole lot of distance between yourself and the subject at minimum focus. You're probably going to want to remove the lens hood to keep from shading. However, that 0.20 times magnification is useful. Not quite at the level of the Tamron's 0.50 times magnification. At the same time, however, this is a whole different level of lens. Overall, I mean, that's fantastic. It looks great on the camera. The size, the dimensions are wonderful. I'm really, really pleased with the build and handling of this particular lens. So a lot of great things going on here. I mean, this is a fantastic form factor in that it's large enough, as we're going to see, to give incredible performance. There's not really any compromises when it comes to the size and the performance, but at the same time we have got really nice materials. We have got feature-rich build in terms of it having really basically everything that a GM lens would have, and I think a fairly comparable level of build. But all of that at a much more reasonable price than what you're going to find for any of the G Master lenses. And so I'm pretty delighted at the handling that I find here, and the feature set that really isn't matched by, I mean, there's been a number of lenses that have come out in the last year, actually, since I had that conversation that I referenced, and those include, you know, the Samyang 18mm f2.8, the Tamron 20mm f2.8, but then also some zooms like the Tamron 17 to 28 millimeter f2.8 zoom, the Sigma 14 to 24 millimeter f2.8 DM. All of these lenses have certain strengths and attributes, and I've covered them all. But in many ways, I think that this is the most comprehensive package. Let's talk about the autofocus here for a moment. This has Sony's dual linear motor design, and so you have linear motors on either side of the moving elements that cause focus, and so byproduct of that is that it is super fast, super quiet, no issues at all with focus speed or sound. You basically are not going to hear the focus taking place, you know, unless you're actually like to shoot with your ear up against the lens barrel, and even then, if there's any environmental sound, you won't hear much of anything. That was true too when I tested for focus pulls. You can see in this, it is essentially completely silent. Focus pulls, as you can also see, are smooth, and so this focus motor assembly, it's quiet, it's fast, it's smooth, all of those things that you could ask for. My only indictment that I have here, and really of the lens itself, does come on the focus motor, and that I did notice a bit of pulsing. For example, in this little video clip here, this should be a setting where focus locks and stays, and instead you can see there's just a little bit of a micro pulsing taking place. I also noted that on a few occasions when actually shooting photos, particularly if all points were active, and so there would be a little bit of a pulse, and if you happen to take the photo in AFC mode during that time, you could end up with a completely defocused result like this when it should have looked like this. And that happened on a couple of occasions to me, enough so that I noted it as a part of my review. I did notice a little of that same behavior with the 24mm F1.4 GM, although I do think it's maybe a little bit more pronounced here. And so the solution to that is basically to either shoot with less points active or to shoot in AFS mode when you're shooting landscapes. It seems to only happen when I'm shooting at smaller apertures in a landscape type setting. That's really the only criticism I can offer up to this point of anything. And as we're about to see, I don't really have hardly any more criticisms than that when it comes to the image quality and the optical performance of the lens. Let's dive in and see why that is. So let's start by taking a look at our distortion and vignette. So first thing I do want to point out is that while there is a fairly mild amount of total vignette, you can see that it is a somewhat complex pattern optically. It's not really linear, so it almost behaves a little bit like pincushion distortion on the sides and a little bit like an uneven barrel distortion on the top. It's only a few percentage points, but it's actually not easily to manually correct for. The profile does a good job of correcting for it, and of course having first party support means that that's really not going to be a major issue. As we could also see, there is some vignette to start off, a couple of stops, not amazingly heavy, but not non-existent either. It does start to lift by f2.8, f4, clearing up a fair bit. To put that distortion into perspective, however, here is the last 20mm lens that I reviewed, and that was the Tamron 20mm f2.8. And as you can see, while it's linear, there is a massive amount of barrel distortion there, and so comparatively, this almost looks corrected already. I saw no issues with longitudinal chromatic aberrations. As you can see here, we've got good levels of contrast and basically no visible longitudinal chromatic aberrations. I also saw zero issue with lateral chromatic aberrations, and so here you can see a really high contrast zone up here, and you just don't see any lateral CA, so kudos to them, great job on correcting those aberrations. If we took a quick look at resolution, we can see center of the frame, we've got a strong performance, we've got a really strong kind of mid-frame performance, and if we look at either corner, you can see that there's a little loss of sharpness and contrast, but really it's holding up quite well. And again, to help to put that into perspective, we can see comparing to the GM. Now the GM is shot unfortunately on a lower resolution that shows a little bit more contrast. What it doesn't show is more resolution, and so we see a strong performance compared to the GM. It gets even better when you compare it to more similar competitors. If we stop down to f2.8 to do an apples to apples comparison with a lot of the more recent comparisons, we see that it is much sharper along the edge of the frame compared to the new Tamron 17 to 28mm at 20mm, which is pretty close to the strongest part of the zoom range there. Looking at the center of the frame, the difference is not as pronounced, but you can definitely see that the Sony is sharper by a good margin. We can see a night and day difference if we compare it to the Samyang AF 18mm f2.8. So much more resolution in the center of the frame, and if we jump over into the corner, it's just startlingly better for the new Sony. If we can compare it to the Tamron 20mm f2.8, which is actually quite a sharp lens, but we can see that the Sony is destroying it at f2.8 in the corner, and also is a clear winner in the center of the frame as well. If we stop on down to f4, we can see that contrast continues to boost up, looking really exceptional now. Corners are just looking really fantastic. And in our mid-frame, we can see that we've got tons of resolution and contrast, enough so that we're starting to see a moire pattern taking place there. Even when mounted on a 42 megapixel A7R III, we can see that there's plenty of resolution at f1.8. If we jump into a pixel level, you can see that the contrast and the resolution, all these fine needles are really nicely resolved. Here's another landscape image at f1.8, and so you can see here at the plane of focus, even towards the edge, resolution really looks fantastic. So as we saw during our hands-on, you can get in very close with this lens, and as you can see in the center of the frame, our resolution and contrast look really fantastic at minimum focus, even at f1.8. I actually think that the bokeh looks pretty decent for a wide-angle lens, and of course the ability to get in close to the subject helps in this regard, and then actually allows you to create a fairly creamy background. Here's another example here, and you can definitely see that it tends towards circling your out of focus area, but at the same time I think that it's a pleasing looking overall result. And here, I mean, looks very, very nice in this transition zone. It doesn't look too busy to me, and that's a lot of pop there for a wide open result. I think that colors are really quite nice also from the lens, and so it makes for a great landscape option. Flare resistance is also quite good, and so here you can get a look at both the bokeh, which shows quite a nice roundness even towards the edge of the frame, as you can see looking all around here. Also our flare resistance, that's basically it in terms of ghosting right there, not bad at all. Stop down to f11, we can see that once again we're not seeing a lot of ghosting artifacts. We've got a little blob right here, and you can start to see 9 aperture blades, and so an 18 pointed sunburst there. Here's a middle aperture f5.6, and so shooting right into low sun, so we can see a bit of a flare pattern, but I don't find it obtrusive or obnoxious at all, so I'm actually quite pleased with this result. You can also see that when panning across the sun wide open, that even though we're a little overexposed due to shutter limits, there's not a lot of flare or ghosting. And stop down, we can also see that it's holding up quite well, and contrast is really strong. So a quick look at Coma. Although this was not optimal conditions, it doesn't get dark until really late right now, and you can see that the moon was super bright. However, you can see center of the frame at f1.8, star points are really, really nice and crisp. It helps to have such a sharp lens to begin with. As we move towards the edge, you start to see a little bit more Coma taking place, and so it definitely is some Coma at f1.8. I didn't find much of a difference at f2. As you can see, it looks pretty much the same. However, stopping on down to f2.8, most of that disappears, and so now we have a pretty clean result. And so I think it's still a good option, because by the time that a lot of other lenses are starting, you're down to where you're getting really excellent results. So as you can see, this lens actually compares really favorably to the lenses I compared it to. And so this is obviously a really strong performance with no real vulnerabilities. The only kind of vulnerability there is that while there's a very minimal amount of distortion, the distortion pattern is a little bit complex. But fortunately, having full profile support either in camera or in software makes that kind of a non-issue in the real world. So overall performance really excellent. So in conclusion, at around $900 US, this obviously undercuts the GM lens by about $500. It is, of course, more expensive than lenses like the Tamron 20mm f2.8 or the Samyang 18mm f2.8, but those lenses are f2.8 lenses. They don't have hardly any of the features that this lens does, and they aren't as optically good. Kind of the only advantage that one of those other lenses has is that the Samyang is smaller and lighter, and so that might be important to you. And the Tamron does have that excellent magnification. In many ways, I would say if you're in that price range, the really only lens that I would consider cross-shopping is the Tamron 17 to 28mm f2.8 zoom lens. Now, I recognize f2.8 is not f1.8, and so if larger maximum aperture matters to you and overall absolute performance, I think the 20mm G is the way to go. Some people might prefer the flexibility of the zoom lens, the ability to go wider and a little bit longer with the focal length, and so that might be a consideration. At the same time, I think that Sony has really knocked it out of the park with this lens. It really delivers. It's basically the exact way that I would have drawn it up. And so kudos to Sony for delivering a really well executed total package here that I think is going to really delight a lot of photographers and give them some amazing photographs. I'm Dustin Abbott. If you'll check out the description down below, you will find linkage to my full text review. Also linked to an image gallery if you want to go look at photos. There are buying links there if you'd like to purchase one for yourself or shop a little bit more thoroughly. Also linkage there to follow me on social media, to become a patron, to sign up for my newsletter. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.